On an afternoon washed in pale gold light, Miss Eliza Harrow sat alone, at a small table meant for two. The porcelain before her gleamed with a delicacy that mocked her solitude, its thin rim catching the tremor in her fingers. Around her, the tea salon breathed with quiet judgment, silk skirts whispering across polished floors, while gloved hands lifted cups like rehearsed gestures in an unending performance. No one addressed her. No one needed to. It was enough that she remained unaccompanied, a conspicuous absence where a gentleman should have been. She held herself upright, spine as straight as the etiquette that shaped her, yet the faint tightening at her mouth betrayed the effort cost to remain composed. Once, she had occupied such rooms with expectation, her laughter light as the spoons chiming against china. Once, her name had been spoken with gentle interest, accompanied by approving nods and speculative smiles. Now, it traveled in softer tones, slipping between parted lips like a secret too delicate to be declared. "Miss Harrow," someone murmured behind a fan. How unfortunate! The word lingered in the air. Not cruel enough to wound openly, yet sharp enough to press upon the bruise of her pride. Eliza lowered her gaze to the tea she had scarcely tasted, watching the faint ripple upon its surface, as though it might reveal a future kinder than the present. It did not. Instead, memory intruded with unwelcome clarity, recalling the morning her engagement had been dissolved with a letter so brief it seemed an afterthought. There had been no explanation, only a withdrawal couched in politeness, so immaculate it bordered on indifference. Society had filled the silence eagerly, as it always did, weaving conjectures that clung to her like damp lace. Some suggested impropriety. Others hinted at concealed debts. None had asked her for the truth. The truth, she suspected, would have disappointed them. It lacked spectacle, and society preferred its tragedies adorned with scandal. A soft chime announced the opening of the salon doors, and a hush fell that felt deliberate. Eliza did not look up at once. She had grown accustomed to entrances that excluded her, yet the atmosphere shifted with a subtlety that pricked at her awareness, and she found her eyes lifting despite herself. The Duchess of Wycliffe stood at the threshold, her presence commanding without effort, as though the room itself had been arranged to receive her. Age had refined rather than diminish her, silver threading through dark hair like deliberate ornament, her gaze keen enough to unsettle even the most assured among them. Conversations resumed in softer tones, each attendee acutely aware of being observed. Eliza expected the Duchess to pass her by, as others did, acknowledging her existence only insofar as it served as caution. Instead, the older woman paused, her attention settling upon Eliza with unnerving precision. It was not pity she saw there, nor was it disdain. It was something far more dangerous. Interest. The Duchess crossed the room with measured grace, each step quiet yet unmistakable. When she reached the table, she inclined her head in a gesture that carried both courtesy and command. "Miss Harrow, I believe?" Her voice was low and controlled, the sort that compelled attention without raising itself. Eliza rose instinctively, her training asserting itself even as uncertainty stirred within her. "Your Grace," she replied, her tone steady despite the quickening of her pulse. The Duchess regarded her for a moment that felt longer than it was, as though assessing not merely her appearance but the strength of her composure. Then she gestured toward the empty chair opposite Eliza. "May I?" The request was unnecessary. Refusal had never been an option. Eliza inclined her head once more, and the Duchess seated herself with unhurried elegance. For a brief instant, neither spoke, the silence between them thickening with unspoken purpose. Eliza became acutely aware of every detail of her own person, from the modest cut of her gown to the careful arrangement of her hair, wondering what conclusions were being drawn from such observations. At last, the Duchess leaned forward slightly, her gloved hand resting upon the table with deliberate lightness. "You will forgive my boldness, Miss Harrow," she said, her gaze unwavering. "But would you consider saving a family from disgrace?" The words settled upon Eliza with the weight of something far greater than their measured tone suggested. Surprise flickered through her composure, swiftly contained, yet not entirely concealed. "I am afraid I do not understand your Grace." The Duchess's lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, as though she acknowledged both the truth and futility of the statement. "Understanding is not required, my dear," she replied softly. Only discretion and a willingness to be adaptable. A chill traced its way along Eliza's spine, subtle yet insistent. She sensed the edge of something irrevocable approaching, though its shape remained indistinct. The Duchess continued, her voice lowering further until it seemed meant for Eliza alone. My son, the Duke of Wycliffe, has developed an unfortunate habit of refusing every suitable match presented to him. Eliza listened, her confusion deepening even as a strange anticipation began to stir. It has created a difficulty that must be resolved with some immediacy. The Duchess paused, allowing the implication to settle before delivering the final blow. You see, Miss Harrow, he requires a fiancée. The word struck with quiet force, echoing against the fragile dignity Eliza had so carefully maintained. For a moment, she could not speak, the absurdity of it warring with the unmistakable seriousness in the Duchess's expression. I fail to see how I might be of assistance. The Duchess leaned closer, her whisper carrying the faint scent of lavender and inevitability. Pretend you're my son's fiancée. The world seemed to still, the murmur of the salon receding into something distant and unreal. Eliza felt the fragile remnants of her former life shift, as though a door had opened onto one. The agreement was sealed not with warmth, but with precision, as though Eliza Harrow had stepped into a contract rather than a courtship. By the following morning, her quiet anonymity had been replaced by a spectacle so deliberate it bordered upon theatrical. Invitations arrived, carriages called, and her name, once murmured with pity, now traveled through London with startled urgency. She had not been restored. She had been repurposed. Their first public appearance unfolded beneath the vaulted ceiling of a gallery, where light spilled through tall windows and gilded frames captured the gaze of those who pretended to admire art while studying scandal. Eliza entered on the arm of the Duchess, every eye drawn not to her beauty alone, but to the question she embodied. When the Duke of Wycliffe approached, the atmosphere shifted with an almost audible tension, as though expectation itself had taken breath. Lord Adrian Wycliffe did not bow immediately. He regarded her first, his expression composed yet edged with something colder than indifference. His presence carried an authority that required no announcement. It was etched into the way others moved aside, into the silence that formed around him. When he did incline his head, the gesture was exact, neither more nor less than required. "Miss Harrow," he said, his voice low, measured, and devoid of welcome. "My lord," she replied, matching his restraint with care. His gaze lingered a moment longer than courtesy demanded, assessing, calculating. "My mother has always possessed a remarkable talent," he remarked, "for acquiring what does not belong to her." The words were quiet enough to avoid notice, yet sharp enough to strike their intended mark. Eliza felt the sting, though she refused to let it show. "Then I must endeavor not to disappoint her acquisition," she returned, her tone even, though her pulse betrayed her composure. A flicker, so brief it might have been imagined, crossed his expression, as though he had not expected resistance. From that moment, their performance began. They moved through society like figures bound by invisible thread, their proximity choreographed with careful intent. At dinners, his hand would hover at the small of her back, never quite touching, yet close enough to suggest possession. At the opera, he leaned toward her during intermission, his voice pitched low in conversation that others strained to overhear. In Hyde Park, their carriage rolled at a measured pace, granting the public ample opportunity to observe the illusion of intimacy. Yet beneath the surface of this carefully constructed display, tension coiled with increasing force. He spoke to her as one might address an obligation, polite, distant, precise, yet his attention never wavered. She felt in the weight of his gaze, in the subtle shifts of his posture, as though he were studying not merely her actions, but her reactions. The first token came without warning. It was presented during a small gathering, intimate enough to sharpen its significance. A velvet case appeared in his hand, offered with formality that drew immediate notice. Eliza hesitated only a fraction before accepting it, aware that hesitation itself would be read as meaning. When she opened it, the sapphire within caught the candlelight, its deep blue brilliance startling against the pale interior. A murmur rippled through the room, soft yet unmistakable. "For appearances," he said, his tone neutral, though his eyes did not leave her face. "For appearances," she echoed, fastening the brooch at her throat with steady fingers. Yet the stone felt heavier than ornament, its presence an unspoken declaration that extended beyond mere pretense. From that evening onward, the narrative shifted. She was no longer merely the unfortunate Miss Harrow. She had become the woman who had secured the Duke of Wycliffe. Speculation transformed into fascination, and fascination into envy sharpened by disbelief. Invitations multiplied, each one carrying the implicit demand that she prove herself worthy of the role she occupied. Not all received her transformation with grace. It was at a ball, resplendent with chandeliers and the restless shimmer of silk, that the first true fracture appeared. Eliza stood at the edge of the dance floor, aware of the currents moving around her, when a voice, clear and deliberately unsoftened, cut through the hum of conversation. "How remarkable," Lady Pembroke observed, her smile edged with something brittle, "that fortune should favor those who have so recently fallen from it." The remark drew attention without appearing to seek it, a calculated precision that made retreat impossible. Eliza met the woman's gaze, recognizing the challenge beneath the civility. "Fortune," she replied, "is seldom so discerning as we might hope." A faint ripple of amusement passed through those within earshot, though it did little to soften the tension. Lady Pembroke stepped closer, her voice lowering just enough to sharpen its intimacy. "Or perhaps it is not fortune at all, but ingenuity. One does wonder what qualities might persuade a gentleman of such standing." The implication hung between them, unmistakable and corrosive. Before Eliza could respond, a presence at her side altered the balance entirely. The Duke stood beside her, his expression unreadable, though the stillness in him carried unmistakable force. "You wonder a great many things, Lady Pembroke," he said, his voice quiet, yet carrying with a finality that silenced the immediate circle. She inclined her head, though her smile did not falter. "Only what society itself invites, your grace." He regarded her for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond propriety. "Then allow me to relieve you of the burden of speculation." His gaze shifted briefly to Eliza, not seeking permission, but acknowledging her presence in a way that altered the air between them. "Miss Harrow's honor stands beyond your comprehension, madam." The words fell with a weight that no one could mistake. Conversation stilled. Curiosity sharpened into something closer to awe. Lady Pembroke's composure held, though the faint tightening at her mouth betrayed the blow. Eliza felt the shift as keenly as any observer. This was no longer mere performance. There had been no necessity in his defense, no advantage to be gained from such public declaration. Yet he had spoken with a conviction that resonated beyond obligation. As the music resumed and the room exhaled, he turned to her, offering his hand with formal precision. "Shall we?" he asked, as though nothing of consequence had occurred. She placed her hand in his, aware of the warmth of his touch despite the barrier of gloves. "Of course, my lord." They moved onto the dance floor, their steps aligning with practiced ease, yet the rhythm between them felt altered, as though something unspoken had taken root. His hand rested at her waist, firmer now, less tentative, and when she met his gaze, she found it no longer distant, but searching. "You should not have done that," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the music. "On the contrary," he replied, his tone measured, though something beneath it had shifted. It was long overdue. The dance carried them through patterns both familiar and newly charged, each movement drawing them closer to a truth neither had agreed to confront. Eliza felt it in the steadiness of his hold, in the way his attention did not stray, in the quiet intensity that replaced his earlier detachment. When the final note faded, he did not release her at once. Instead, he leaned slightly closer, his voice low enough to belong only to her. "Tell me, Miss Harrow," he said, his gaze holding hers with unsettling clarity. "At what point does pretense become indistinguishable from truth?" Rain arrived without warning, a sudden orchestration against the carriage roof that turned the road to Wycliffe Manor into a ribbon of glistening uncertainty. Eliza sat opposite the Duke, her gloved hands folded with deliberate stillness, though each jolt of the wheels seemed to echo the disquiet within her. The journey had been intended as a brief formality, a visit to satisfy expectation. Yet the storm altered its purpose with quiet insistence. When the carriage finally drew to a halt beneath the looming facade of the manor, retreat was no longer possible. Wycliffe Manor rose from the mist like something half-remembered, its stone darkened by rain, its windows aglow with restrained welcome. Inside, warmth greeted them, though it did little to dispel the peculiar intimacy imposed by circumstance. Servants moved with efficient discretion, removing damp cloaks, lighting additional candles, preparing rooms that had not expected guests. Yet beneath the rhythm of their service lingered the awareness that something unplanned had taken hold. "The roads will not permit a return tonight," the Duke remarked, his tone even, though the glance he cast toward the storm suggested more than inconvenience. "You must remain." Eliza inclined her head, accepting what necessity dictated, though the knowledge settled upon her with a weight she could not ignore. To remain under his roof, removed from the scrutiny of society, felt at once liberating and perilous. "As you wish, Your Grace." He studied her briefly, as though measuring the distance between compliance and consent. "Adrian," he said at last, the single word carrying a quiet insistence. "You may call me Adrian, at least within these walls." The informality unsettled her more than any impropriety could have done. "Then you must call me Eliza," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. Something shifted in his expression, subtle yet unmistakable, as though a barrier had been acknowledged, if not yet lowered. Evening unfolded with a strange deliberateness. Dinner was served in a smaller room, the vastness of the manor tempered by the intimacy of candlelight. Conversation moved cautiously at first, confined to the safe territories of weather and travel. Yet silence lingered at the edges, pressing inward. Eliza found herself acutely aware of him, of the way his gaze would settle upon her when he believed she was not looking, of the restraint that seemed less practiced now, more deliberate. "Do you find this arrangement tolerable?" he asked suddenly, setting aside his glass with measured care. "Tolerable?" she echoed, considering the word. "It is necessary." His lips curved faintly, though there was little amusement in it. Necessity is seldom so elegantly received. "And yet," she replied, meeting his gaze with quiet steadiness, "we adapt to what we must." Something in her answer held his attention, drawing it deeper. "You adapt remarkably well, Miss Harrow." "Eliza," she corrected gently. "Eliza," he repeated, the name settling differently upon his tongue, less formal, more deliberate. "You wear this deception as though it were your own." The observation struck closer than she expected. "Perhaps because I have had practice," she said, her composure faltering just enough to reveal the truth beneath it. He did not look away. "Your former engagement," he said, not as a question, but as an invitation. The room seemed to quiet further, the storm beyond the windows receding into a distant murmur. Eliza felt the weight of the moment, the fragile line between concealment and confession. "It ended," she said at last, her voice steady despite the memory it summoned, "without explanation. One morning there was simply a letter, and by afternoon there was nothing. And you were left to bear the consequence," he said, his tone sharpening with something that bordered on anger. "As women often are," she replied, a faint edge entering her voice. "It is remarkable how swiftly absence becomes guilt when one is not permitted to speak." His gaze darkened, not with judgment, but with recognition. "You were wronged." The simplicity of the statement unsettled her more than any denial could have done. "I was dismissed," she corrected softly. "The distinction is significant." He leaned back slightly, though his attention did not waver. "And yet you remain," he said, "not diminished, as they would have you believe, but resolute." She held his gaze, feeling the truth of his words settle uneasily within her. "Resolution is often mistaken for strength," she said. "It is, in truth, merely the refusal to collapse." The silence that followed was not empty, but charged, as though something unspoken pressed against its boundaries. At last, he rose, crossing the room to where a small cabinet stood against the wall. From it, he withdrew a narrow length of ribbon, faded with age, its color softened by time. "This," he said, returning to her, "was given to me when I was a boy, before expectation had taken hold." He held out, the gesture unexpectedly intimate. "It has no value beyond memory, yet it has endured." Eliza hesitated, then accepted it, her fingers brushing his briefly. The contact was slight, yet it carried a warmth that lingered. "Why show me this?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Because," he replied, his gaze steady. "It is the only thing I possess that was never given for the sake of appearance." The implication settled between them, fragile and undeniable. Slowly, he reached toward her, his movements deliberate, as though granting her time to withdraw. She did not. With careful precision, he removed the sapphire brooch from her gown, its brilliance dimmed in the softer light, and replaced it with the ribbon. The contrast was stark, almost jarring, yet felt truer. "If this were real," he murmured, his voice lowered to something that belonged only to the space between them, "would you regret it?" The question hung suspended, its weight undeniable. Eliza felt her breath catch, the answer rising unbidden, yet held back by the fragile boundary they had not yet crossed. "I do not know," she said at last, the honesty of it both a confession and a defense. He studied her, as though searching for something beyond her words. "I think you do," he replied softly. Before she could answer, a sharp knock at the door fractured the moment, the intrusion abrupt and unwelcome. A servant entered, his expression carefully neutral, though urgency lingered beneath it. "Your Grace," he said, bowing slightly, "a message has arrived from London." Adrian's gaze did not leave Eliza at once, as though reluctant to relinquish the fragile connection that had formed. When he did turn, the shift was immediate, the intimacy replaced by something more guarded. "Very well," he said, accepting the letter. Eliza watched as he broke the seal, her fingers tightening slightly around the ribbon. The room seemed to hold its breath as his eyes moved across the page, his expression altering with each passing line. "What is it?" she asked, unable to keep the question from her voice. He looked up then, and for the first time since she had known him, uncertainty flickered openly in his gaze. "It appears," he said slowly, "that our deception has attracted more attention than anticipated." By the time they returned to London, anticipation had hardened into expectation, and expectation into a quiet, relentless demand. Eliza felt it in every glance that lingered too long, in every conversation that faltered as she approached, in the subtle tightening of smiles that concealed calculation beneath civility. The illusion they had crafted no longer belonged to them. It had been claimed by society, reshaped into something that required fulfillment. A pretense might be tolerated, even admired, but an unresolved one invited scrutiny that could not be indefinitely deferred. The Duchess of Wycliffe received them in a drawing-room that seemed arranged not merely for comfort, but for control. Light filtered through tall windows, illuminating the measured elegance of her surroundings, yet nothing in the room felt accidental. She regarded Eliza and Adrian with composed satisfaction, though her gaze lingered upon them with a discernment that unsettled even the most carefully maintained composure. "You have done well," she said, her tone smooth, her approval precise. "Society has accepted what it was meant to question." Eliza inclined her head, aware that the praise carried an implication she could not ignore. "I am glad to have been of service, Your Grace." "Service," the Duchess repeated softly, as though testing the word. "Yes, that is, after all, the nature of such arrangements." Her gaze shifted to her son, its warmth cooling into something sharper. "It is time to conclude it properly." The words settled with quiet inevitability. Adrian's expression remained composed, though a tension gathered at the edge of his stillness. "You refer to an announcement." "I refer," the Duchess replied, her voice unwavering, "to a formal engagement. It cannot remain an implication. Society demands declaration, and we must oblige it." Eliza felt the room narrow, its carefully ordered elegance pressing inward. This had always been the trajectory, the logical conclusion of a deception designed to satisfy expectation. Yet hearing it spoken so plainly stripped the illusion of its fragile ambiguity. "And afterward?" she asked, the question escaping before she could restrain it. The Duchess regarded her with measured patience. "Afterward, Miss Harrow, matters will proceed as they must. You will have fulfilled your purpose, and the Duke will be free to make a more suitable arrangement." The words did not wound as she might have expected. Instead, they clarified something that had remained deliberately obscured. She had never been intended to remain. She had been a solution, not a choice. Adrian's gaze shifted to her, something unspoken passing between them before he turned back to his mother. "You presume a great deal," he said, his tone controlled, though the quiet beneath it carried an edge. "I presume only what has been agreed," the Duchess replied. "You required time, and I have provided it. Do not mistake accommodation for indulgence." Silence followed, heavy with implication. Eliza felt its weight settle upon her, not as pressure, but as a strange, unexpected clarity. She rose then, her movements composed, though her pulse beat with quiet insistence. "You have been most generous, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the shift within her. "I would not wish to impose upon that generosity further than is necessary." Adrian's attention sharpened, his gaze fixing upon her with sudden intensity. "Eliza," she met his eyes, holding them with a calm that surprised even herself. "It has been an arrangement," she continued, her tone gentle yet resolute, "one that has served its purpose admirably. It need not be extended beyond its usefulness." The Duchess watched them both, her expression unreadable, though satisfaction lingered faintly at its edges. "A sensible perspective," she said. Eliza inclined her head once more, then turned, her departure as measured as her arrival had been. Yet each step carried a weight that threatened to disrupt the careful composure she had maintained. She did not falter. She would not grant them that. It was only when she reached the quiet of the corridor beyond that the air seemed to shift, the restraint she had held so firmly beginning to loosen. She had expected this moment, had understood its inevitability, yet understanding did little to soften its impact. What unsettled her was not the end of the arrangement, but the realization that she had begun to wish for something beyond it. "Do you intend to leave without a word?" His voice reached her before she heard his footsteps, its quiet intensity arresting her movement. She turned slowly, finding him standing a short distance away, his composure less certain now, the distance between them charged with something unresolved. "I believe my words have been spoken," she replied, her tone steady, though her breath fell unsteady within her. "You spoke to my mother," he said, taking a step closer. "Not to me." She held her ground, though the space between them seemed to narrow with each movement he made. "What remains to be said?" "Everything," he answered, the word carrying a force that startled them both. Silence followed, not empty, but waiting. "You cannot mean to accept this," he continued, his voice lower now, though no less intense. "To step away as though it were nothing more than a performance concluded." "Was it not?" she asked, the question quieter than she intended. His gaze held hers, unyielding. "It may have begun so," he said, "but it did not remain so." Her composure faltered, just enough to reveal the truth she had sought to contain. "That changes nothing," she replied softly. "The terms were never ours to alter." "Then let us alter them," he said, the words emerging with a sudden clarity, as though the decision had formed long before he spoke it. She stared at him, uncertainty flickering through her. "You cannot mean that." "I mean precisely that," he replied, stepping closer still, until the distance between them was no longer sufficient to maintain the illusion of detachment. "You were meant to be a deception," he said, his voice steady, though something within it had shifted irrevocably. "Yet you have become the only truth I possess." The confession settled between them, its weight undeniable. Eliza felt the fragile defenses she had constructed begin to yield, the certainty she had clung to dissolving beneath the force of his words. "And what would you have me do with such a truth?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Believe it," he said. The simplicity of the answer struck deeper than any declaration could have done. She searched his gaze, seeking any trace of uncertainty, any indication that this was merely another performance. She found none. "Society will not permit it," she said at last, the reality she could not ignore pressing forward. "Society," he replied, his tone sharpening with quiet defiance, "has already taken more than it is owed." Before she could respond, the sound of voices drifted from the drawing-room, the murmur of expectation growing louder as others arrived. The moment contracted, its intimacy threatened by the return of the world beyond it. He reached for her then, his hand closing around hers with a firmness that allowed no retreat. "Come with me," he said. "To where?" "To the ballroom," he answered, his gaze unwavering. It is time they heard the truth. Her breath caught, the magnitude of what he proposed settling upon her with sudden force. And if the truth destroys everything? He held her gaze, his expression resolute, though something within it softened, just enough to reveal the depth of what he risked. Then it will at least be ours to lose. The ballroom doors opened not with ceremony, but with consequence, as though the very hinges understood the gravity of what they permitted to pass. Light spilled outward in a cascade of gold, illuminating the gathered assembly within. Ladies adorned in silk and expectation, gentlemen arranged in clusters of measured confidence, all of them suspended within the delicate machinery of society that thrived upon spectacle and certainty. When Adrian Wickliffe entered, Eliza's hand enclosed within his, the murmur that rippled through the room was immediate, electric, and hungry. She felt every gaze settle upon her, weighing, assessing, remembering. Not long ago, those same eyes had dismissed her as a woman gently erased from consideration. Now they watched as she crossed the threshold beside a duke who had defied their predictions, and in that shift lay both her restoration and her greatest peril. Adrian did not release her hand. His grip remained steady, unyielding, as though the connection between them had become something more than gesture. The Duchess stood near the far end of the room, her composure immaculate, though the stillness in her posture betrayed an awareness of disruption. She had orchestrated many outcomes, shaped many narratives, yet this moment unfolded beyond her design. Her gaze fixed upon her son, sharp and questioning, before shifting to Eliza with a coolness that held neither warmth nor welcome. Adrian guided Eliza forward, each step deliberate, the distance between them and the center of the room diminishing with sense of inevitability. Conversation faltered, then ceased entirely, leaving a silence so complete it seemed to echo. When he stopped, he did not turn to her at once. Instead, he faced the assembly, his expression composed, though something within it had hardened into resolve. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying with effortless authority, "I am aware that my recent conduct has provided you with a great deal to consider." A faint ripple of restrained amusement passed through the room, quickly subdued, as though no one dared misjudge the tone of what was to follow. Eliza felt the tension gather, coiling with anticipation. "It is perhaps unfortunate," he continued, "that society so often mistakes silence for uncertainty and arrangement for truth." His gaze shifted then, finding hers with a clarity that seemed to narrow the world to the space between them. "I intend to correct that misunderstanding." Her breath caught, though she did not withdraw. She understood, in that instant, that whatever followed would alter not only her standing, but the very fabric of the life she had come to accept. "This woman," he said, drawing her slightly closer, "was presented to you as a convenience, a solution to a difficulty of my own making." His voice did not falter, though its quiet intensity deepened. That was, at the time, an accurate description. The words struck with precision that caused a stir among the listeners, their curiosity sharpening into something more urgent. Eliza felt the truth of them settle within her, not as a wound, but as a reminder of where this had begun. "It is no longer accurate," he said. The shift was subtle, yet unmistakable. A murmur rose again, this time edged with disbelief, as though the room itself resisted the implication. The Duchess's gaze sharpened, her composure tightening, though she did not intervene. "I have been accused," Adrian continued, "of indifference, of reluctance, of a failure to meet expectation." A faint, almost imperceptible curve touched his mouth. "These accusations are not without merit. I have refused what was offered to me because it lacked what I required." "And what is that?" A voice called from the edge of the room, emboldened by curiosity and disbelief. Adrian did not look toward the speaker. His attention remained fixed upon Eliza. "Truth," he said simply. The words settled with a force that silenced even the most restless observer. Eliza felt its weight, its resonance, its danger. This was no longer performance. It was a declaration that would demand consequence. "She was asked to pretend," he said, his voice lowering slightly, though it carried no less power, "to stand beside me as something she was not, in order to satisfy a society that values appearance above sincerity." His grip on her hand tightened, not painfully, but with unmistakable intent. In doing so, she revealed the very thing I had long refused to acknowledge. The air seemed to thin, every breath drawn with heightened awareness. Eliza's heart beat with a force that threatened to break through the composure she had so carefully maintained. "I will not ask her to continue pretending," he said. The words fell like a fracture through expectation. The Duchess took a step forward then, her voice cutting through the silence with controlled urgency. "Adrian," she said, "you will consider—" "I have considered," he replied, turning to face her at last. The respect in his posture remained, but it no longer yielded authority. "I have considered the cost of silence, and I find it far greater than the cost of truth." Their gazes held, a quiet battle waged without raised voices or visible conflict. Then, with a steadiness that left no room for doubt, he turned back to Eliza. "You offered to walk away," he said, his voice softer now, though no less resolute, "to preserve a future that was never truly mine." His expression shifted, the restraint that had defined him giving way to something far more vulnerable. "I will not permit it." Emotion surged within her, swift and undeniable, though she struggled to contain it. "You do not know what you risk," she said, her voice barely steady. "I know precisely what I risk," he answered, "and I know what I refuse to lose." The clarity of his conviction left no space for retreat. Eliza felt the fragile defenses she had constructed dissolve, replaced by something both terrifying and luminous. "And if I cannot bear the weight of what follows?" she asked, the question emerging with quiet honesty. His hand lifted slightly, as though to steady her, though it was his gaze that held her. "Then I will bear it with you." The simplicity of the promise struck deeper than any declaration could have done. Around them, society waited, suspended between judgment and revelation, yet in that moment it seemed distant, almost irrelevant. He drew a breath, then spoke again, his voice carrying across the room with quiet certainty. "I will marry her," he said, "not as an arrangement, not as a concession, but as a choice." The reaction was immediate, a swell of voices rising in disbelief, in shock, in something that bordered on outrage. The Duchess's composure faltered, if only for an instant, as the reality of his defiance settled into something irreversible. Eliza felt the world shift, its rigid boundaries loosening beneath the force of what had been spoken. She had been dismissed, pitted, reduced to a cautionary tale. Now she stood at the center of a declaration that demanded recognition, not only of her presence, but of her worth. "Adrian," she whispered, the name no longer tentative, but certain. He turned to her fully, the noise around them fading into insignificance. "Eliza," he replied. For a moment, neither spoke, the space between them filled with everything that had led to this point. Then, with a quiet resolve that matched his own, she inclined her head. "Yes," she said. The single word carried further than any speech, settling into the charged air with a clarity that silenced even the most persistent whisper. The machinery of society, so long defined by expectation control, faltered in the face of something it could neither predict nor contain. And as the room struggled to reshape its understanding, to reconcile what it had witnessed with what it believed possible, Eliza realized that the greatest transformation had already occurred, not in how they were seen, but in what they had chosen to become.